Okay, continuing on with some of these thoughts. In Genesis 3, after they eat the fruit, they put fig leaves on and they hide. And there are two things that they need to be protected from. Okay, and I've mentioned one of them. It's the presence of God, right? God's presence went from being the warmth and wonderfulness of Eden to something that was terrifying. Okay, so that's one thing they were trying to hide from. The other thing they need protection from is in the next bit of conversation when God shows up and he starts to talk to them, and he says, like, Adam, where art thou? And then, and Adam, there's an interesting conversation between Adam and God and Eve and God and everything. And I'll get into that in just a second, but I want to point out that basically what God says is, he says now all the three characters involved, the snake, the woman, and Adam, are going to be cursed. Okay, and I think that, in my opinion, I think that the curse is the natural consequence of the fall. That God's just explaining to them what's going to happen, and in fact, God is going to make it better for them. Like, God isn't the source of the negativity. This is just because if we're going to buy into this version of creation that I'm talking about, like, things just happen. Like, the natural consequences flow. Like, whatever you plant, whatever seed you plant, you will reap it. Like, whatever you sow, you reap. And that's actually the idea of a tree too, right? Is like the tree produces the fruit, the consequence, just the natural consequence of things, because the earth is like the law of justice, as I mentioned in the creation story. And the water itself has in it the idea of reflection. Like, the elements themselves just reflect back. Like, as Newton might say, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. Or as you might say, in the Eastern religions, there's something like karma, right? And in the Book of Mormon, it's called the law of restoration. And in different parts of the Book of Mormon, it's called the law of justice or whatever, right? Like, so there's just this thing woven into the fabric that just reflects back to you whatever actions you've done, or produces the consequences. So God's, I think, just describing the consequences. And the reason why I think that is because the two things, like when God creates the earth, he says that the earth will produce after its own kind. And then he also says that, like, the animals and women will too. Like, those are the two things that produce after their own kind. And in the curses, Eve, now that there's a fall, will produce in sorrow. Okay, so like that, the mechanism, like in the creation story, those were the principles of justice, or of restoration, or of karma, or of whatever word you want to use that describes kind of this natural flow of things, the natural order of things. And now it's kind of messed up, right? Like, Eve will bear children in sorrow, or will conceive and bear children in sorrow. And Adam, when he works the ground, it will no longer produce fruit like spontaneously. It'll produce thorns and thistles, right, and noxious weeds or whatever. And it'll take tremendous effort to bring forth fruit, not just kind of naturally, right? It'll take extra effort. And same with Eve, it'll take extra effort to produce a child, right? Because, like, the natural order has been corrupted a little bit. It's been polluted, you could say. I'm using that word on purpose because later on, when we get to the temple and the tabernacle in the Old Testament, pollution is the word they use, and they talk about the land being polluted, right? And if you notice in the Old Testament, it's the land and like whether women are bearing children. Those are always the two things that they point to of whether, like, things are working right, whether the land is working the way God intended it to, right? So if when there's a drought or a famine and the earth isn't producing like it's supposed to, then the earth is then there's something wrong. It's like in the Book of Mormon, if they don't prosper in the land, it's because they're not keeping the commandments, right? And then as Elder President Christofferson taught in conference recently, the Hebrew poetry shows that it's not prosperity like wealth or riches, although it could be that. It's prosperity because you are living, because the Spirit is your companion. Because the sentence in parallel to not prospering in the land is that it says, if you keep my commands, you prosper in land, and if you don't, you won't have my spirit. So prospering is like the natural consequence of having the spirit. And so it doesn't necessarily mean wealth. It means like prospering in the spirit, which could include wealth, but it's not the primary purpose of it, right? But the point I'm making is that how the land is doing is an indicator of how things are going. And same with women and whether they're giving birth. That's why there's so many stories in the Old Testament about women who have trouble giving birth. Okay, is because after the fall, that's one of the consequences. It's going to be difficult for Eve to conceive and give birth, and there are many stories about that. And they're just like with Adam, it'll be very difficult to produce food. And so that's why you have this focus in the scriptures on those two things, is that like the natural order, justice has gotten out of whack. And the reason why is because eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was like an action, a planting of an action that brought forth certain consequences. The earth just reflected back to Adam and Eve, and and Eve's body, which is also a piece of earth, right? Because Adam and Eve are made out of the earth, just reflected back to Eve and Adam what their choice was, and their choice was to embrace death, right? That's what the tree of knowledge of good and evil is. It's death and without God, it's just straight up death. With God, death can become knowledge of good and evil. But the point is they had to go pass into the shadow of death. That's why, like women give birth and they go into the shadow of death to do it. Like that's where all this, that's the kind of concept you need to think of. So they embraced death, and death in all of its manifestations, not just physical death, but spiritual death and emotional, and trials and tribulations are manifestations of death, because it's like things aren't working the way they're supposed to. Like the world is wonky now. It's not right. Something's off, right? That's the world of death. That's the shadow of death that's overhanging us. And that's what was invited in by eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And because of Jesus Christ, it can become knowledge of good and evil. Without him, without the atonement, then it's just death, and you end up being an angel to the devil, and all the goodness you can reap out of the fall, you won't reap, right? So anyway, the point is that the things are out of whack, and those are the indicators in the scriptures of whether things are going well. Are women giving birth, and is the land producing fruit, right? And that flows right out of this story. And the reason why those are the things that flow out of the story is because that's what's set up in the creation account in Genesis 1. It's the land will produce fruit, and everything will bring forth after its own kind, including animals and women and people and stuff, right? So if that stuff isn't working right, then the earth isn't working right? And so you see that in the next story of Cain and Abel, where Cain kills Abel and spills his brother's blood onto the earth, and the earth cries out for justice, right? The demands of justice are there, and the earth and God comes to answer the demands of justice on behalf of Cain, right? Or Abel, who was murdered, right? And so that's what you need to see this as, is like as a symbolism, right? As typology. And not to say these things aren't true. Like the land was producing noxious weeds and everything, and it is difficult for women to give birth. It's extremely difficult. They enter into the shadow of the land of death, basically, to do it, right? So like that is true. But it also has this like typological and symbolic value to teach us about what's happening in this life. So they need to be, so Adam and Eve need to be protected from the full blast of God's presence. That's why they ran and hid. But now they face another problem. Once they're outside of God's presence, you start to get into the realm of death and chaos again, and darkness and all that, and now what are you going to do? You need to be protected from that. So they're stuck, right? So what does God do? He has to kill an animal and make them coats of skins to protect them from that. And so the coats of skins are like a true atonement, whereas the fig leaves were just like a false atonement, like their puny efforts at trying to cover themselves. The coat of skins is like a true atonement. It covers them up and protects them from the full blast of God's glory, so they won't wither and wilt in His presence, and they can endure His presence. They can abide in His presence, and they need to, in order to live, they need to abide in His presence, and they also will not be overwhelmed by like the thorns and the thistles and everything. Could you imagine walking around alone in the lone and dreary world naked or just covered in fig leaves. Like, I think I mentioned this before in one of the videos, is I can't even walk from my house to my trash cans in the side yard because of all the rocks. Like, my feet are so wimpy. It's hard for me to walk on rocks. Could you imagine not having shoes and only wearing fig leaves, to cover like your most private parts, and as you wander around in the Arizona Sonoran desert? It'd be terrible. So you need protection from the thorns and thistles, which are just a manifestation of God, of chaos and death it's bubbling up in our world now, right? And so that's what the coat of skins does. It does that, and it also protects us from the full blast of God's presence, so that basically we can live in this, like, in a stasis where we're not overwhelmed by one or the other, and we can fulfill God's purpose in the fall. And so where do those coats come from? You have to sacrifice an animal, right? More than likely it's a lamb. And although the story doesn't tell us, it's definitely a type and shadow of Jesus Christ, right? That it's Jesus Christ's atonement that covers us and makes it possible for us to abide God's presence and to protect us from the thorns and thistles of this life. Okay, so now I want to point out, in the creation story, God incorporated the bad stuff, but the bad stuff was kind of like dormant or latent. It's kind of the feeling you get because there was a Sabbath, like there was a rest, and God's rest, as D&C 84 tells us, is like God, the fullness of God's glory could be there, right? So God's glory is like the predominant factor in, once His presence and glory is like fully like within all things, then there's order in life. And even though there's darkness incorporated, and even though there's chaos incorporated, they're like tamed, you could say, right? And that world was the Edenic world, but it wasn't going to serve. We wouldn't learn anything that way. So you have to flip the script, and now the bad stuff, the thorns and the thistles and all that stuff, starts to bubble up. But it can't go. It can't go too far that way, or else we'll drown in the waters again, or get lost in the mists of darkness, right? Like there has to be like a stasis, a balance, in order for this plan to work. And the Garden of Eden balance wasn't going to work for the plan because, as I said before, like C.S. Lewis, as much as I love him, his thought on this is wrong. I think we wouldn't have been able to gain the knowledge and experience that we needed to by being in the garden. Even if you get tempted there, the temptation isn't the same when you're resisting from a position where your body is like holy, basically, versus when your body's been corrupted. Okay, so now we're in a state where, like, Eden isn't the primary baseline. Before, Eden was the baseline, and the darkness and the chaos was kind of just there, right? In stasis, in like a balance, and it was tamed. Now the darkness and the thorns and the thistles and the chaos and everything is like kind of running more wild and loose, and the possibility of Eden is there. It's more tame. Like, it's harder to get to it now. And so there's still a balance, but the script has been flipped, and that's what enables the growth. What I want to point out, though, is that the possibility of Eden is there because of the atonement. So you see, that's why these are the three pillars of the plan of salvation: creation, fall, atonement, is because they like line up perfectly. You can't fulfill the purposes of one without the other. And so the atonement basically brings back Eden, makes it a possibility. That's why in the vision of the tree of life, Jesus comes as the tree of life. He's bringing Eden back to this world so that we can choose it again. Okay? And the way he does it is just like he did in creation. The creation story, he came down and he sent forth his word into the darkness and into the chaos, and life came into being, right? And now in the atonement, he comes down again to condescend to our level and goes forth among us, like the vision of the tree of life says, and sends forth his word, his goodness, his grace and truth pours out of him and into whatever he touches, and it's made partially alive again. Like, we've all been touched by him, and that's why we have the light of Christ. Now, that's not enough, though. That just does what 2 Nephi 2 says about making us free from the flesh so that we can choose liberty through Christ. But we still need to choose it. Like, we have now that option because it's a free gift. Like, the gift of choice to choose him has been given to us because he touched us through the atonement. His vicarious sacrifice, where he one by one went and suffered all of the things that have ever happened to us by touching each of those moments of our lives through his vicarious sacrifice. He somehow transferred a little bit of his light into that dark moment of our lives, into that chaotic moment of our lives, so that no matter where we are, there will always be his voice, his word, his light coming into it and saying, come this way, it's okay, I'll lead you out of here, I'll lead you from the mists of darkness, I'll make the chaos into something beautiful, okay? All of that. But that's just the start. And we have to keep going, and that's what the rest of the atonement and the endowment and everything is all about, is the process of a complete and full transfiguration, which results in a resurrection with a glorious body that enables us to walk back into the presence of God, to walk past the angels, to stand as sentinels into the presence of God. And that's how the end of the Garden of Eden ends, is God says, he sets up cherubim and a flaming sword, and he says, don't let them come to the tree of life, and that's the sentinels that are guarding the path to the tree. And you and I cannot pass it because there's swords, these cherubim are like, got flaming swords that are twirling all around, and it'll just slice us up because we're not ready to make that journey in our fallen state. And that's the point, is that you and I have to be transformed, okay, so that we can pass by those sentinels. And the flaming swords, again, I think is symbolic of saying you and I are of such a low, let me step back. Section 67 says that you and I are so fallen, we can't even stand the presence of angels, let alone God, okay? We're not, and angels are of a lower order, right? They're they don't have as much glory and everything, and the glory they have is, from God anyway. So you and I can't even abide that. So that's the point, is the cherubim and the sentinels, the angels, are there to kind of be if you can pass by, you're ready to move on. You have, your capacity and ability to move past has grown. And at the point that Adam and Eve fell from the Garden of Eden, they weren't ready to go past. They needed to be changed and transformed. And that's what the endowment, that's what all the ordinances are trying to do. But the endowment is the culmination of them, that enables us to pass by those angels, okay, and get back to the presence of God, to the tree of life. All right. And it's a transformation, a transfiguration, ultimately a resurrection that will enable us to make that journey and not be harmed by the flaming sword. If I'm a being that has been transformed and resurrected with a body of glory, that flaming sword will do nothing to me, right? But if I'm a weak, fallen creature, that flaming sword will chop me up, right? And so that's the idea. And so the flaming sword isn't that God, it's not that God doesn't want you to come back. It's that you aren't capable of coming back until you change and are transformed. And so the atonement is meant to transfigure us and transform us into beings that can make that journey back. Okay, so I think I covered everything I wanted to in Genesis 3, at least off the top of my head. I might go back at another time and, in the next video or something, and actually read some scriptures to make sure I'd, point out the stuff that I want to highlight, and that I make sure I said everything I wanted to say. One last thing. God said, in the day that you eat from the fruit, you'll die. But then 2 Nephi 2 tells us that's just God. I explain that as that's just because you'll quit vibing, being on the same frequency as God, and so you'll die, right? But God's will, 2 Nephi 2 tells us that God's will is that he didn't want us to die. He wanted to give us a probationary time to be able to repent so that we could come back into his presence. So God's will is different than the reality of his body, which is like a force of nature. It's kind of like you and I, our bodies are different from our wills too. I can have a will, the spirit is willing, right? And the flesh is weak. For me, that's how it works. my spirit, my mind, my whatever, oftentimes will be like, man, I need to get in shape and get all ripped and muscly and everything, like I used to be when I was young. But my body is weak. You know, like it almost has a different mind than my mind, because of the rules of nature that it's operating under, right? And so think of it that way. It's like God loves us and wants us to be near him, but like he has a body sorry, I'm getting my ticket here to get into the parking lot. He has a body that basically, you know, has to be the thing that holds everything together. Like if God ceased to be God, if he stopped being the glorious shining person he is, everything would fall apart and die. So he can't do that. Like it's not, his justice isn't because he's like, everything has to be punished, everything bad needs to be punished, which is how we normally talk about it. No, he has to be just. He has to have order. He has to have all that so that life can exist. Like, just think about, life can't exist without justice and order and consequences and all that stuff. Like it would be meaningless existence. It would be chaotic. It would be like the waters in the darkness on the deep, right? So you and I have to, so God has to be that way out of love to sustain our lives and everything. And so somebody else other than the Father has to, like hold everything in existence, while, you know, all things, not just our life, our world, but like in Abraham 3, all the governing bodies are being governed by God the Father. Like everything is upheld by him, not just this earth. So in order to like, somebody else needed to like dive down into the chaos, and I'm using dive on purpose, because God, because the waters of chaos are like, you know, our world started to become like the waters of chaos, and so somebody had to dive into the waters to save us, and that was basically Jesus. He dives down, and he's got like a lifeline from the Father to him, so that he can dive down and protect us and save us and make everything better. And but when he comes to us, he brings the life and the light that enables life, right? So atonement is the process of creation. Like the very process of creation is the very process of atonement, but the Father has to like stay in the world of glory to hold everything up while Jesus like dives into the deep. It's like a water rescue, if you think about it. When you do a water rescue, you know, you have to have like something that ties the person who's doing the diving to the boat or to the dry land or whatever, right? So that it, you know, the person diving in and doing the rescuing doesn't get lost, right? Doesn't like drown themselves, right? And that connection that keeps Jesus, you know, connected to the Father is like the glory and the presence and everything that Jesus is bringing down with him. And he stays connected to the Father, but then transmits a little bit of it to us so that we can live, okay? Be born again and live again. All right, so the point of, and then so the probationary, so what God, as 2 Nephi 2 said, he wanted to extend that time period, and the way he was able to do it is through Christ, okay? So his will wasn't that we would die in the same day. When he said that, he was basically saying, you die the same day unless I do something to change it, okay? You would die the same day you eat the fruit unless I do something to change it. And the thing that he did to change it was send Jesus down to do a rescue. And because Jesus did that, you and I don't die. Adam and Eve didn't die the same day. Their lives were able to be extended. Like Jesus actually, I want to show this at some point. I'm not saying this metaphorically. I truly 100% believe that we live day to day, breath to breath, because Jesus Christ performed the atonement. I 100% believe that if he didn't do that, you and I wouldn't even exist. Like our spirits might exist because as Abraham 3 says and DNC 93 says, they're eternal and existed before this life. But I mean, we wouldn't have these physical bodies. We wouldn't be here and doing this earth thing. We would be somewhere else. We would be angels to a devil, as 2 Nephi 2 says. And because we would dissolve and we'd be cut off from God's presence. So Jesus brought that back to us. He brought the lifeline. Like when he dove into the chaos and the darkness, he brought, the means to sustain us while we go through this journey. And I really mean that. I really think, I don't know how that works. I just know that's what D&C 88 says. That because he descended and ascended above all things, he's in and through all things the light of truth, and it's the very thing that holds everything in existence and gives us a conscience and makes it possible for God to perform his miracles and everything, including saving us. So, praise be to Jesus, right? All right, so I wanted to say that's my take on that, on the why they didn't die in the same day. A lot of times we say, well, because a day means 1,000 years, and Adam only lived 900 and something years, and maybe that's true. I just think it's, as Lehi said in 2 Nephi 2, God just wanted to extend their life so that they could repent, and so he gave them a probationary period. And the way he did that was that he reconnected them to his spirit through Jesus Christ. Before the flood, when the flood comes, God, their lives are really long, and God says, you know what, you're not going to live as long as you used to, because my spirit won't always strive with men. You're only going to live 120 years now instead of 900 years. And so the point is that without God's spirit, the length of your life also, it shortens. Okay, that's what those things are teaching. And the length of years, maybe they lived 900 years, maybe they didn't. The point is that the lifespans started to shrink as God's spirit started to quit ceasing to strive with them. And notice strive, it means it takes great effort for God to make that connection, because you and I are little bits of chaos now, little bits of darkness that he has to come and shine light into to recreate us and give us purpose and life and everything. And it requires his great effort. And that's the point I want to make. That's what I was trying to make a creation story too, is like, it took effort and sacrifice from God to make this world in the first place. And it takes effort and sacrifice from God to atone for it, which is to recreate it after it fell. Okay? And it needed to fall so that the script could be flipped, and we could learn the lessons, but then also not be lost forever. All right. I hope I'm making sense. Appreciate it. Talk to you all later.